This is the DeFi Decoded podcast by 9 Point Partners in cooperation with Prophecy DeFi. The ideas and opinions expressed in this podcast should not be taken as investment advice. Always consult with your financial advisor before investing.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of the DeFi Decoded podcast. I'm Alex Tapscott here with co-host Andrew Young, and today we've got an excellent guest, Tim Copeland, who is a news editor at The Block, focused on DeFi, NFTs, and DAOs. Prior to joining The Block, Tim was a news editor at Decrypt. He has earned a BA in philosophy from the University of York and studied news journalism at the Press Association. I'm always fascinated by how this industry gets covered. It's been an evolving process that I've found endlessly fascinating. Originally, it wasn't covered at all. And then there was some crypto native publications, which I think charitably didn't really live up to the standards of, good journalism. And the mainstream press has lately begun to cover the industry quite often, but I would say not entirely as well as they should. And in that mix, there's been this new crop of crypto native publications that I think stand apart, The Block being one. I think Decrypt, your old employer, also is doing a very good job, and there's some others as well. So Tim, we're really excited to have you on the podcast just to talk about, first of all, the areas that you're interested in. I know you've got a real tech focus, running the blockchain ecosystem group at The Block, but also just more generally about, how you make sense of this industry and try to explain it in a journalistic manner to readers. I think that's a very fascinating topic. So welcome to the show.
Hey, how's it going?
So let's start off with something I'm interested in, which is that you studied philosophy at the University of York, and then journalism, which obviously makes sense. But would you say that in what way, or would you say the philosophy background influenced your decision to get into crypto, if at all? I just love to understand that connection a bit more. Sure.
I guess in a very practical way, it certainly helped with my job and what I do. With philosophy, you have to look at very complex texts and wade through all the really difficult to read writing and try and understand it and then explain it in a way that anyone else can understand when they read what you write. And I feel like that definitely is a useful skill when writing about crypto. Like it's a lot of it's very difficult to understand, a lot of it's very technical. Information could be in all sorts of different places, and you really have to work hard for you to understand what's going on to get to the point where you can explain it to other people. So like practically wise, yeah, it's definitely made a big impact and gave me good skills for it. In terms of like philosophy more broadly, I think it definitely helps me think more broadly about things. Like philosophy makes you question things, it teaches you a lot of skepticism. Yeah, and I think those kind of skills are very good for a journalist. For me personally, I've always had a very strong curiosity, and I think that's what led me into philosophy, as well as what led me into journalism. Like when, like honestly, over the last 4 years writing about crypto, it's just so interesting. Like it's such a crazy, weird, wacky world, and I find it really fascinating. And pretty much what I do is just when I'm like, this crazy, weird thing's happened, I just want to learn about it. And it's a very similar vibe in a way.
That's an amazing answer. I thought about the latter part, the open-mindedness to new ideas and how that might be helpful. I hadn't actually thought about reading really obtuse, difficult to understand texts and trying to make sense of them, which is kind of like what it feels sometimes to learn about a new, DeFi protocol or new, read a new white paper or something like that. I love that. That's great. So when we first met, you were at Consensus Systems, which, I think probably more than most companies help to really accelerate the development and adoption of, decentralized organizations. And I would say, crypto applications more broadly. Were you always, when you were there, did you always think you were going to, eventually transition or focus more on the journalistic side, or was there something else you were doing at Consensus at the time?
So at the time I was working for Decrypt, which is obviously a crypto news site. And then it was essentially incubated by Consensus, and then they recently spun out and raised some money. So when I joined, it was always just as a journalist. That was my role. And And to be honest, we didn't have a lot of interaction with Consensus. It felt very much like its own kind of little company. Yeah, so it was, I guess, quite consistent for me throughout the time that I just wanted to, write about crypto.
Perfect. And then the decision to move on to the block, I'm trying to get the timing right, but I think it was, sometime in early 2021. By then, Bitcoin had started to rally and there was some talk of a new crypto bull market, but it was really Q1 of last year when the rubber hit the road and things started to go crazy. And then since then, we've had a couple of huge pullbacks. We've had some blowups. We've had some leap breakthroughs. I mean, it's just been a nonstop roller coaster. Is that just this past year, or is that the industry? And what is it like to cover such a crazy industry during such a crazy time?
Yeah, so I joined the block just over a year ago, in May last year. And yeah, I mean, covering this industry it's been crazy. I mean, like, I can't believe it's been 4 years already, but it also feels like it's been a decade, if not two. It's just so nonstop. You can very easily just 24/7 be consumed by it. And yeah, you get periods that are very intense where just things constantly keep happening and breaking and hacks and everything. And then you do occasionally get quiet periods. Like it's most kind of in the deep bear market. So kind of, I think, late 2018, early 2019, gets a little bit boring. Traffic slows down a little bit. But you still, like, you never quite get bored because there's always stuff happening. And that's often when you get really interesting innovation starts happening. Yeah, and I think it's a really good time to focus on building the product. And the companies I've been at have been very rapidly evolving startups. So it's never, you don't really get a break. You don't really get a breather. You just have to keep growing, keep focusing on what you do, and it's very exciting to be part of that.
What's like one area to cover that is kind of more, I guess, is super interesting to you to cover? Like, I guess I'm kind of curious, like, you have a very good sort of macro viewpoint of everything that's happening. Probably one of the best sort of top-down views in the whole industry, kind of seen so much of sort of the news flow. I'm just kind of curious if there's one area in particular that kind of excites you or interests you the most.
Yeah, so I mean, in terms of what I focus on at the moment right now is basically I have a team focused on kind of blockchain ecosystems. So like DeFi, DAOs, staking, governance, airdrops, layer twos, all of that jazz. To me, I think one of the biggest things is staking / governance. So like, I think it was towards the end of last year when everything was kind of booming, I wrote a piece on staking, how it basically had exploded and how it was essentially almost as big as Bitcoin mining. And I don't think people quite realized it, but you suddenly realize, like, all of these blockchains, like pretty most of them except for Bitcoin and a few of its forks, are proof of stake. Ethereum is moving to proof of stake. Staking is soon will be a kind of a majority of the industry. And then at the same time, you had such a massive rally in the price of proof of stake tokens that it meant staking companies were making a lot of money. Like one that I mentioned in the piece was making, I think, 10 million in revenue per month. And it's more comparable to Bitcoin mining pools than to Bitcoin mining directly. But if you compare to Bitcoin mining pools, they're about the same level. Compared to Bitcoin mining, it was still a little bit lower. And obviously, that was at the staking kind of peak. Things have declined considerably since then, but it's still a massive business. And it's just such a big part of the whole crypto space. And then I think that combines quite neatly with governance, which is still very emerging, very different like levels of governance from across different like DAOs and platforms and stuff. Some it's essentially just pseudo governance, some it's real on-chain governance. And I think what you're realizing here is these are actually controlling the future of these protocols. And these protocols, some of them make significant revenue if you look at Token Terminal. So yeah, I think it's really fascinating to watch this, to look at the infrastructure for these protocols and chains and think and watch over what's changing, who the key decision makers are, how this whole process works, and then also just it's very closely tied in with staking as a business. Yeah, that to me is one of the most interesting things to watch, and it's obviously like growing very rapidly.
Yeah, I think, and obviously we have to sort of talk a little bit about the Ethereum switch to staking. There's obviously been a lot of sort of worries that proof of stake is going to lead to more centralization. And then you have things like Lido, which I think controls around 40% of the total stake now. I'm just kind of curious, given that you've seen so many, I guess, maybe challenges and so many different things popping up in the staking of all these other smart contract chains, a lot of them obviously being from Polkadot and Cosmos. I'm just kind of curious, what are your thoughts on the upcoming shift to Ethereum proof of stake and any kind of implications that you can draw from your experience covering the other proof of stake networks?
Sure. I mean, obviously it's going to be an absolutely huge shift. It's been a long time coming. Yeah, in terms of Lido centralization, there's a really interesting governance discussion happening right now about whether they should limit their kind of share of the staked ETH. So that's something we're watching. We've got a feature coming out on that, which is very interesting. In terms of like security, I mean, it's quite hard to compare because you've got chains like Solana that has been going down a bunch of times recently, and each time they have to like restart the chain and turn it off and on again. And then today we saw Osmosis had a hack, and that's in the Cosmos ecosystem where pretty much like every project has its own blockchain. And then what they did was they just paused the network. Would that happen to Ethereum? I mean, maybe, what if it had the DAO situation again? Or is Ethereum going to be like, no, we're not going to pause the network ever because, decentralization. So there's a lot of, I think, open questions there that will be quite curious to see how it plays out. And I don't think you can ever really know necessarily what's going to happen. But yeah, I mean, I think it will be quite a big milestone for the industry as it will go, predominantly staking will be the majority consensus mechanism. And then we'll see how that develops. I mean, there's the whole kind of ESG narratives. There's, maybe people might suddenly have this big shift back to Bitcoin, or maybe staking will grow and take over like most of crypto. It's certainly going to be very fun to watch and to report on.
Yeah, well, we're expecting some news, momentarily, on that. It's interesting. It's like trying to swap out the engines of a airliner mid-flight without, upsetting the drink cart or disrupting the in-flight entertainment system. Like, you've got all these apps running on the, on the network. You've got all these different stakeholders that have vested interest, and they're going to try and make this switch happen. It's kind of insane, and I think it's going to be interesting to watch for sure. I think regardless, it'll be the lesson will be don't start as a proof of work if you want to be proof of stake eventually. Just skip that stage altogether, because the idea of switching consensus mechanisms like mid-flight is pretty wild. Yeah, I mean, I'm personally looking at it. I mean, obviously, it's like you mentioned a couple of angles. There's the ESG angle, which I think is probably overstated. But there's also this just general like supply question, which is basically like, miners have been selling ETH into the market, and the amount of new ETH is going to decline by, estimates of 80% or something like that. And so that combined with the burn mechanism could mean that actually Ether becomes disinflationary rather than inflationary. And instead of having to look for willing sellers, willing buyers every time, the new ETH gets minted and the miners need to sell it, you're actually looking for new willing sellers, because otherwise there's like a buy bias in the network, which is sort of crazy to think of. It's a real paradigm shift. And maybe it leads to Ethereum becoming immensely more valuable, at least on a per ETH basis, sort of like a share buyback, where like the total market capitalization doesn't need to grow with the for the individual token to increase in value. That would also be very fascinating. Maybe it leads to more and different proof of stake networks, continuing to gain ground. Like that's something we've talked about on the podcast, this idea that Ethereum started with 99% of TVL at the beginning of last year in DeFi and ended with 60%. The total value increased, obviously, but their share decreased as these other platforms became more popular. I don't know. It's going to be a very interesting thing. I think probably the market is pricing in a merge delay or a merge cancellation, or there's a merge apathy that I think is not fully appreciated, that if this actually gets pulled off, it's going to be a massive catalyst for the industry.
Yeah, I mean, I guess you've got obviously the tokenomics. It is a very significant change in tokenomics. And then the two other factors are that ETH, at least its price, remains very closely tied to Bitcoin. So the question is whether or not it can kind of decouple and do its own thing for kind of those tokenomics to have an effect, or potentially if they do, when they have an effect, if it leads to a decoupling. And then the other thing, I guess, is the timeline of the merge. Like people, if they think that if they think it's bullish and they want to buy tokens now, we still don't know exactly when the merge will happen. And obviously, it has been a long time coming. It does seem like it's going to happen relatively soon. But, at the end of the day, there's no official timeline because it's basically once the tests are finished and, like the test that's happening today would have happened a few weeks ago had it not been for some bizarre miner pumping the hash rate on the test net and just causing it to fail and then having to do it again. So, I think when the merge happens or is imminent, I think it's going to get very interesting to see what happens with the tokenomics and potentially the price as well, because I mean it's a similar-ish event to a Bitcoin halving in a way.
Oh, that's an interesting analogy. Yeah, fascinating. So maybe just switching back to your day job and covering this industry. So I think that there's been a big improvement in the last couple of years in the quality of coverage, and I think the block Masari with its analysis, Decrypt, some of these other entities, Forecast News, I think does a good job too. That I think has been a bit of an antidote to the hyper promotional, kinds of coverage that we've got in the past. I think that, in the early days of crypto, everyone was so insecure about whether this was going to happen that any sliver of good news got distorted into some massive announcement when in fact it wasn't. We still see a bit of that, but what do you see as the role of the block in the industry?
Sure. So our focus is on just providing very accurate, very informed information on everything when it comes to digital assets. We have particular expertise when it comes to deal flow, like seeing which companies are raising. Like we broke the story about BlockFi the other day. And then we also have a big focus on policy and regulation and on tracking changes there because we believe that's really important. And then also on technological changes, which is kind of more what my team focuses on, and on tracking, the latest updates and the latest kind of big changes when it comes to blockchains, protocols and things like that. So that's our main focus. We're not focused on trying to be too clickbaity. We're not focused on purely just trying to get traffic just to sell ads. We have a much more sustainable monetization model. And yeah, we just want to be the place where you can be informed and stay ahead of what's happening and everything with crypto. And we have our team is growing incredibly rapidly, which is really exciting. I can't believe that we had just kind of 30 people, maybe 35 when I joined, and now at least 100 more people since then. It's been a crazy ride, but our team is getting incredibly good and incredibly fast at breaking news. And it helps having such a large research department that just really informs our journalism and gives us, access to researchers where it's if we want to check something, or if we need help when it comes to deciphering something that's on chain, we have these experts that are able to help us, and it can definitely help us avoid making some mistakes, and helps us to give a better understanding of what's really going on to our audience.
Yeah, and obviously the market's been sort of super choppy over the last couple of weeks. Obviously, the interest rate rises have been playing a part in inflation. I'm kind of curious, over the last, like in the really short term, sort of last month, excluding Luna, obviously it was a huge event. Any sort of trends you're seeing recently that have really caught your eye, something that sort of our listeners and your readers should pay attention to?
As in specifically referring to the market, or just general blockchain trends?
Yeah, I'm just like, for example, like one thing that a lot of people have been talking about is how obviously like the public crypto prices have gone down quite a bit, but the private market's still been very hot. I guess just in the private market, for example, I'm sure there's been a bunch of news recently. Projects are still raising huge. I saw a $60 million Series A today, for example. I'm just kind of curious if, I guess more specifically to the private market and the fundraising that you were talking about, do you think that will kind of cool off, or do you think, I'm just kind of curious what you sort of think about that divergence between the private market and the crypto market?
Yeah. So there's like two important things. One is, yes, that there will be an impact for sure. I mean, to see Coinbase and several other big companies freeze hiring, especially like in Coinbase's case in such a dramatic fashion, is concerning. When you have, that's obviously related to their share price. And then when you have BlockFi raising a down round, it's all signifies that perhaps rounds were being inflated in many ways during the bull run. And then now people are kind of have a dose of realism. Wait a minute, these prices aren't going to keep going up forever. Yeah, I mean, people have been in a bear market before. It's like, it's not a surprise. That said, I think the industry is in a very different position to, say, like the bear market in 2018 in one crucial way, and that's venture capital funding. So if and the researchers at the block have been doing, like John D'Antoni, he monitors this really carefully, monitors pretty much like every raise, and it's just incredible the sheer amount of funding that came in. I think it's like 25 billion last year, and then like continued into this year. And we didn't have that before. Like before, you had crypto projects would do an ICO, they'd raise money, it would be in their native token, their native token goes down 90%, it's all over. Whereas here, and obviously, yes, plenty of these kind of things were selling tokens, and obviously many projects have treasuries in certain tokens, whether it's ETH or their own token or whatever. As we saw the other day, one project was considering, Lido was wondering, should we sell our ETH into stable coins to make it more sustainable? But I do believe that compared to like 2018, most projects have a lot more funding in general than they did at the time. Just because venture capital funding, I think it's more likely people have dollars in a bank account or equivalent, or maybe stable coins, as opposed to tokens that might be heading down like 90%. And I think because of that, it means people can still keep building and they can still keep hiring. So like I do a monthly hiring roundup, and for example, like last month, even though we started to have firms like Coinbase cutting back on hiring, like I tracked like 55 pretty big hires last month alone, and it was exactly the same as the previous few months. Hiring over the last year, frankly, has been absurd in terms of the amount of talent this industry is attracting and the amount of talent kind of moving around within the industry. And since all these firms continue to have their venture capital money, they can continue to attract talent, they can continue to pay their staff, and they can continue to keep building. And I think that's what's quite different. And that's why I do think this bear market might be different in some ways. Like you'll find some projects will be a lot more resilient. And then other projects with bad treasury management, or who didn't kind of necessarily raise any funds, might struggle. yeah, I think that is kind of a two kind of important parts there.
Fascinating. One of the things that I look at is, I mean, you pointed out the VC funding for last year, but the headline on some of these rounds in Q1 and Q2 have been even bigger. I mean, the Andreessen fund, the Katie Hawn fund, even Binance. Like Binance has got a $500 million fund. Everyone's like, doesn't even register. But that, a year ago would have been meaningful. So I think that there's going to be this bid in the market, and I wonder where it's going to go. Like, is it going to go to new early stage, seed round opportunities? Or will some of these funds look at those projects that are down 90% but aren't broken and have good fundamentals and say, maybe this is just a better use of cash than, chasing something that's not yet in the market? I honestly don't know how that's going to play out. But I think in general, it's everyone's sort of wondering, notwithstanding the BlockFi down round and, the hiring freeze, I think Andrew's right that, I mean, still the private markets are running hot, maybe not as hot as they were. And I agree that rounds were being inflated, but there's just too much capital chasing, too few deals, I think still. So we'll see how that all plays out. I'm really not sure. So we've got a few minutes here, Tim. I just want to get your take on some of the big sort of shifting trends you're seeing in the industry. We've talked a lot about the market. We talked about finance, funding, and and talent, and all these other important questions. But where do you see, based on the fact that you run this blockchain ecosystem group, like what are some of the areas that you're seeing the most interest and the most growth right now?
Sure. I mean, I guess I answer that in part in terms of kind of staking governance. That's where a lot of infrastructure is being built. I mean, what else is changing? A lot of things are staying the same in many ways in terms of the hacks keep happening, continuous kind of exploits. DeFi obviously has been in quite a longish kind of downtrend. You kind of wonder how that's going to develop. Is DeFi going to come back, or is it going to kind of keep sliding? And for example, one of my writers pointed out the other day that we haven't really seen DeFi in a bear market yet. Like, it's only been around kind of 1-2 years. So how is it going to face? Is it going to kind of come back in many ways? You've also got a trend that I quite liked. I looked into quite a bit, where you've got the financialization of NFTs, where you've got people taking out loans using NFTs as collateral. Like that was exploding very quickly at the start of this year. So there's certainly kind of developments there. Obviously, NFTs have these kind of short, sharp hype cycles. At the moment, NFTs are down, but they're very unpredictable assets. And you still have some, like the goblins suddenly shot up the other day. Like there's still things like that happening. Crypto is very hard to kind of pick out the broad trends because it's so kind of sporadic. I mean, and then you have like just random events like Luna just collapsing, going to zero. I guess kind of better security is one thing that I guess hopefully should be a trend, both in terms of maybe blockchain stablecoin development, treasury management, and just kind of Discord security and just general NFTs, like kind of both the kind of users and the projects.
Absolutely. Andrew, do you have any other questions?
Yeah, my last question, I kind of have to ask it, is what was it like to cover the sort of Terra Ust situation a month ago? Obviously, it must have been pretty crazy, I imagine, but yeah, really just curious to hear your firsthand look.
Yeah, it was absolutely fascinating. Like, I mean, we've never seen anything like this happen before. We recognized very early, because I mean, everyone knows how UST Luna was designed. Everyone knew what would happen in the case of a bank run. So the moment we saw it start to lose its peg, it was like, well, this could completely collapse. And so basically everyone just had a big focus on covering it. We just kind of went full board at it. The one of the things that stood out to me that I thought was most fascinating was just the supply increase. Like just the point at which it kind of achieved escape velocity, and you had that like death spiral, and the supply went from like, it started at 300 million and popped up into the billions, and then like went all the way up to 6.5 trillion. Like I had Eagle, one of our researchers, creating graphs of this, and it's just a flat line and then all the way up. Like, it looks like it starts at zero just because the supply's increased so much. And it's just absolutely insane compared to like any other token. And it's amazing the information gap or discrepancy kind of in the market, because many people weren't aware how it worked, all of these risks. You had people buying Luna on the dip thinking, it's going to go up, not realizing it's in this death spiral. It's very interesting to see. It was interesting to see what happened to traders as well, because a lot of people were shorting it, and then it had sudden spikes with these like optimists who were like, oh no, it's going to come back. It was a very interesting event in the crypto space, and one of the, I think, the most just one of the largest events we'll probably ever witness.
Hopefully that's right.
Well, I mean, they're already like, you've got Justin Sun trying to recreate the exact same design on a new chain that kind of already has a bigger ecosystem. So it's maybe we might be just going to repeat it. Yeah.
Well, we'll see. History doesn't repeat, but it often rhymes. But I think in crypto, it just repeats sometimes, honestly. We have to change that old saying. Tim, great to connect with you. Thanks for joining us. Some really fascinating insights, covered a lot of different topics. Where can people follow you, learn more about your coverage, the block, all that good stuff?
Sure. So, I'm on Twitter at Tim C. Copeland. That's where I mostly tweet out regular news updates, but more increasingly just memes and general thoughts on what's happening in the space. Obviously the blog, theblockcrypto.com. And yeah, I've also, you spoke earlier about kind of reputable kind of crypto news sites and that kind of growth there. Something I've actually been working on with a friend is a project called onecryptofeed.com, which basically is a simple crypto feed that only takes stories from the right sources. So kind of select crypto media sites, and then also crypto stories from select mainstream sites. So that's something that I've kind of felt the industry's needed for a while. So kind of piece that together and hope that it will make it easier for people to kind of see the right stories and to not be drowned by all the noise.
Yeah. Well, I, for one, would benefit from that. It'd be an amazing resource to have. So good luck with it. Thanks. That's it for today's DeFi Decoded. Thanks, everyone, for joining. We will see you next time. Take care.
The information contained herein does not constitute an offer or solicitation by anyone in the United States or in any other jurisdiction in which such an offer or solicitation is not authorized, or to any person to whom it is unlawful to make such an offer or solicitation. Prospective investors who are not residents in Canada should contact their financial advisor to determine whether securities of the funds may be lawfully sold in their jurisdiction.